Good morning to this listening audience as we assemble from our homes in this experience of fellowship and worship. Though we're not able to see each other, our hearts are united in our praise toward the God who has been so good to all of us. We thank you that wherever you're calling from, for choosing to be with us on this morning. We ultimately hope that God is pleased with the praise that we render him. And we also want you to know that we are encouraged by the joining together through this technology forum, whereas the devil cannot keep us from worshiping our God. And so we give him thanks that things are as well as they are. I want to thank both of our song leaders for the words of praise that have been delivered. Appreciate Brother Gerald Brown as he and his family are grieving a loss of a dearly beloved loved one, and yet his ability to be strong for his family and to be able to continue to be a part of our worship experience. And I thank Brother John Mitchell, and I am appreciative for that particular song because God's people need to be reminded that we have victory in Jesus. And shortly, we will be calling on Brother Kevin Green to offer prayer requests for those who are in need of heaven's answers to life's questions. But I wanted that song to be sang so that prior to our prayer requests, our minds can be comforted by the fact that we have victory in Jesus. This morning, I want to direct your attention to the book of Hebrews. If you will meet me in the 11th chapter and verse number 8 is where we will begin our reading for this Lord's Day. Again, that's Hebrews chapter 11, and we will begin reading at verse number 8. We encourage you to take notes, to jot down scriptures, and to go back and read those notes and read those scriptures, as we are confident that there is a blessing in the words found on the pages of inspiration. Hebrews chapter 11, beginning with verse number 8, the Bible says, "By faith, Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out not knowing whither he went. By faith he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God." From this passage, the subject this morning is, where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? Our study of the Bible provides two meaningful benefits to us. The most important and most obvious is that it serves as a road map to heaven. Man, because of sin, is on the pathway to eternal destruction in hell. But the Bible is God's map to redirect our course so that we might be with him for all of eternity. Yet the Bible's benefit to us does not stop there. It also serves as our instruction manual to navigate through this otherwise confusing journey called life. Naturally, we possess a worldview. That is, we think and act through the lenses of our worldly perspective. That perspective causes our problems and explains our pain. We need, as best we can, God's perspective. The way we have been doing it is getting us in trouble again and again. Learning to approach life with a God view as opposed to a world view makes the difference in not only our eternal fate, but it is the difference in how we experience time. For this reason, the text in Hebrews has been selected to help us to navigate through this current crisis from which none of us are exempt. When this coronavirus problem began to unfold, many terms were thrown around to describe its impact on humanity. Unprecedented became the buzzword to describe the toll it would take on human lives. Unprecedented became the word that economists use to describe the effects on the stock market. Unprecedented is that word that businesses use to express how changes in businesses would become a reality as they handled a new and unprecedented reality. Limitations were placed on people everywhere, all across the world, in hopes of mitigating the effects of this deadly virus. And I am absolutely convinced that whenever humanity faces an unprecedented event, the ability to come out victorious requires unprecedented faith. That's why Abraham's narrative deserves our utmost consideration and understanding. At a time when so much is unknown, when so little progress has been made, and when no clear leadership exists, we are either left to our own thinking or must come to trust God like never before. Currently, this problem that plagues people everywhere has no certain end date in mind. Though states are slowly but surely reopening, the death toll continues to rise. Without a vaccine or cure, there's no barometer to determine when it will actually be safe to return to business as usual. The lack of criterion for safety is lost on the minds of elected officials who politicize this problem as if the virus discriminates along party lines. Economists and the health community clash about wealth and health. Indeed, these times are troubling to the soul. Any experiences of anxiety are warranted. How to respond to that anxiety is the purpose for which this message shall hope to accomplish. Where do we go from here? I have come to discover that answering this question necessitates other questions being asked. Where do we go from here? It is determined first by where we are in terms of our attitudes about comfort versus being conquerors. Where we go from here depends on whether we want to be comfortable or whether we want to be a conqueror. Second, where we go from here is determined by our creativity. Third, where do we go from here is a destiny requiring commitment. In essence, to answer this question, where do we go from here? We have to assess and come to understand where we stand in terms of comfort, where we stand in terms of creativity, and where we stand in terms of commitment. And if we are able to answer those queries, then we are able to determine where we go from here. First, consider this thought. Where we go from here depends on whether we want to be comfortable or conquerors. Beloved, faith never promises comfort nor convenience. At its core, faith upsets the very notion of comfort and must be exercised at often moments of personal inconvenience. This demonstration of faith's challenge is quite evident in Abraham's life. In Genesis chapter 12 and verse number 1, we read a fascinating tale about becoming uncomfortable in order to become a conqueror. There we see in Genesis 12, verse number 1, these words. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing, and I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. One could easily look at Abraham's mention in Hebrews 11 as one whose name is in the Hall of Fame of faith. We could all want and desire that level of recognition by God that he would mention Abraham among those who demonstrated great faith. But what we have to come to see about Abraham is that in order to have been listed as one of great faith, Abraham had to be willing to find himself uncomfortable, having to leave his country, his kindred, and his father's house. God upset his comfort zone. Genesis 12 shows how faith upended Abraham's level of comfort as he knew it. The rewards of faith can only be realized by the exercise of faith in periods of testing. And sometimes that exercise is rigorous, and the testing is a prolonged period of time in which that faith is exercised, but you cannot get the glory without the story. Many want the glory of being recognized as great, the glory of being recognized as awesome in the display of faith, but that glory comes with much story. And a part of that story is a willingness to become uncomfortable. You cannot be a conqueror and be comfortable at the same time. A conqueror must be challenged. A conqueror must face unprecedented times. A conqueror must face challenges. A conqueror must be prepared for the unknown. A conqueror is never one who always finds himself comfortable. And a comfortable person at all times is never a person who could be described as a conqueror, because these two thoughts are not thoughts that are easily reconciled. Comfort and conquering often come at two different extremes on a spectrum. In order to have a conquering faith, a person must not only be prepared to overcome this pandemic, but that individual must be prepared to overcome himself. That is, the coronavirus problem is only secondary to the insecurities, anxieties, and fear that lie within the hearts of those who have been unsettled by this crisis. Until you deal with you, until I deal with myself, the outward problems will never be addressed properly until the inner man finds some strength to press on. That's why Ephesians chapter 3 and verse number 16 continues to be relevant today. Paul penned those words of encouragement in the first century. And yet we find that the basic premise there continues to have significance in our lives. Paul said that he would grant you according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with might by his Spirit in the inner man, in order for us to conquer the problems that we confront or the problems that confront us. We need to deal with the innermost part of our being. The greater problem is not the problem on the outside. It's not the coronavirus. It's not other ailments. It's not those problems on the outside. The greater problem is the man on the inside and his weaknesses, his insecurities, and his inability to deal with life. That's the problem that needs to be addressed. And so we have to accept the momentary discomfort while we walk the path before us. It is in that God is trying to move us from our point of comfort to that of being a conqueror. A conqueror is one who sees the challenge, faces the challenge, and addresses the challenge. We could shrink at the sight of the problem. We could give up. We could become discouraged and resign ourselves to continued comfort. But comfort will never find us standing on top of the mountain, achieving any measure of victory. Comfort will only find us sitting in the valley, quietly resigned to the idea that we did not try, and so we can claim no victory. When I look throughout the Bible, I am encouraged that sometimes you must become uncomfortable in order to become a conqueror. When I read the sacred scriptures, I see that Moses in Exodus chapter 2 and verse number 21 is said to have been content to dwell with his father-in-law and his wife. And yet God called him out of that comfort, out of that contentment, to lead the nation of Israel from bondage on toward the promised land. When I read in the Bible, I discover that God often upsets comfort zones in order to make someone a conqueror. Joshua had to lead a grieving people in Joshua chapter 1 across the chilly streams of the Jordan. Surely it was not comfortable to have to face this new experience of leadership after the death of Moses, dealing with stubborn and grieving people, is not a combination that one as a leader would desire, and yet God called him to lead those people to the promised land. When I look in the Bible and I see in 1 Samuel chapter 14, a man by the name of Jonathan, the son of Saul. Saul was a coward. And there came a day where Saul had to battle the Philistines, and surely it was not a comfortable experience, especially with having a spiritually weak daddy in the person of Saul. And yet God allowed Jonathan to become uncomfortable to successfully defeat the Philistines. That was an uncomfortable experience, but it led to him being a conqueror. We read in 1 Samuel chapter 17 about God through Samuel calling a young ruddy boy by the name of David, who was comfortable tending to his daddy's sheep. And God called him out of that comfort and told him to go and defeat a Philistine giant by the name of Goliath. In order for him to have conquered that, he had to be willing to be uncomfortable. When I read about Elisha in 1 Kings chapter 19, somewhere around verse number 20, Elisha was comfortable plowing the field with the yoke of oxen. And there was a man by the name of Elijah who God determined needed some assistance in doing the job that was before him, because Elijah found himself distressed and full of anxiousness. And God summons Elisha. And what is interesting about Elijah and Elisha is that the Bible tells us that Elijah performed 8 recorded miracles. Elisha, his successor, performed 16, having asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. Elisha would have never performed 16 miracles had he not been willing to become uncomfortable and leaving his mama and daddy. In fact, he said, let me go and kiss my mother and father goodbye so that I can go and do what God has called me to do. There comes a time where in order to be a conqueror in faith, you have to endure a period of being uncomfortable. And so where do we go from here is the question of the hour. Answering that question is determined by your willingness and my willingness to endure moments of discomfort, moments of inconvenience. The second part of determining this direction, where do we go from here, is determined by our creativity. Some wonder why God permits human suffering. That question baffles the minds of both philosophers and theologians, not to mention the common man wrestles with understanding the reality of suffering. One thing lost in the quest to understand God's permissiveness of that which we abhor is the discovery of new ways to express our potential. Without sickness, man would not be able to tap into his God-given genius to create medicines and cures. Without natural disasters, man would never have the notion to discover ways to create safer buildings for his habitat. Without accidents, man would not study ways to improve safety in things like airplanes and automobiles. Without victims, man's heart would not be inclined to seek the welfare of others. Without those who suffer, the compassion in man would never be evoked to bring about social service programs, advocacy groups, and protective measures to limit abuse. I do not suggest that God gives us the undesirable intentionally. All of the problems we encounter and the pain felt comes as a result of living in a fallen world. The Almighty provides us the means to overcome this fallen state by instilling within us the drive and ability to overcome difficulty. And I would suggest to you that as we look at how to be creative in the midst of problems, that this problem that we are facing, that the church will never be the same, and thank God for that. The problem with the church is that it has become defined by four walls. It has become hindered by man's traditions. And the church, in many regards, has become stifled by a lack of fervor for the cause of Christ. And this reality shows us what the church has the potential to do and what the church has the potential to become. And I want to submit that in many regards, this is a welcome time for the kingdom, because it is not only shaking our faith, but it is shaking the church. And it is getting our attention like never before. Recall, if you will, Revelation chapter 2, verses 2 through 4. There we are told about the church at Ephesus. It was a busy church. Many of our churches today are busy. There was a working group of people. We have people working in our churches today, and they were a determined group of people. And we have determined people. But even in their busyness, in their working, in their determination, we find in this passage a word that speaks to a problem there, right there in Ephesus. Revelation 2, beginning with verse 2, I know thy works and thy labor and thy patience, and how thou cannot bear them which are evil, and how thou hast tried them which say they are apostles and are not, and hast found them liars, and hast borne and hast patience, and for my name's sake has labored and has not fainted. Nevertheless, I have somewhat against thee, because thou hast left thy first love. Notice the compliment to the church. Notice the things that were affirmed, and yet we see a word there, nevertheless. God is saying that there still is a problem, even in the midst of a busy church, in the midst of a working group of people, in the midst of a determined people who did not faint. Nevertheless, they lost their first love. Now more than ever before, we have to give our attention to God. And our first love cannot be the beauty of our buildings. Our first love cannot be the traditions that we so honor and fight about. Our first love cannot be the power and the privilege of being in charge and having positions in the Lord's church. Our first love has to be the God of this world who loves us and who calls us to deliver a message of hope and redemption to lost souls. There can be no greater concern for the church than to snatch from the hands of Satan souls who are in jeopardy of eternal damnation. Now, more than ever before, we are forced to be more creative and less traditional. Now we may not be dressed up for this Sunday worship experience. The likelihood is those on this call are not sitting around in their Sunday best. They are perhaps wearing their most comfortable clothes, and yet we are now able to give to God real, authentic worship because our focus is not on projecting an image to those who will see us and evaluate us and compliment us, but now our focus is on giving our hearts and souls to God because we know we need Him and we are forced to admit that we need Him. This is absolutely awesome because the God who gave us the mind to engineer technology now allows us to use that technology for more than just a traditional gossip on Facebook. We get to use this technology for more than just social media with conversations that go nowhere. Now we get to use technology to help others experience a faith that moves them beyond four walls. No longer are we confined to a building where we have to define church as simply a place. I think it's interesting that worship in the Old Testament was in a tabernacle or a tent. And from there, it moved to the temple. But the New Testament church simply went from house to house. And I'm not discrediting or discounting in the proper context the value of a building. What I am trying to get us to understand is that the real value of the kingdom should never be limited to a building. And that our worship and fellowship now, we understand, can extend far beyond what we've always thought. And now we can reach people in remote places. Now we can reach people in underserved communities. Now we can reach people who have a hunger and a thirst for God's word. And they don't have to sit in our buildings to be members of our churches. They don't have to reside in our cities to be a part of our fellowship. God has made it possible for us to extend beyond our geographical boundaries and get the message of Calvary spread like we've never done it before. When you look at the Bible, I'll give you some scriptures. Take note, I'll mention them twice. God did not restrict worship to a place. Read when you get time Matthew 18 and verse 20. Read Acts 2 and verse 46. Read Acts 5 verse 42. Read Acts 20 and verse 20. Read Romans 16 and verse 5. Read 1 Corinthians 16 verse 19. Look at Colossians 4 and verse 15. Look at Philemon 1 and verse 2. Again, Matthew 18 verse 20. Acts 2 verse 46. Acts 5 verse 42. Acts 20 verse 20. Romans 16 and verse 5. 1 Corinthians 16, verse 19. Colossians 4, verse 15. Philemon 1, verse 2. What I want you to notice is that we do not have to be in a place that has been so designated as a church building to do the work of God and worshiping God and calling others to God. They met from house to house. They went from place to place. And too often we misunderstand the mandate of the Great Commission. The Great Commission says, go into all of the world. And the problem that we've had in executing the command of the Great Commission is that we've told all of the world to come into our building. Now we get to be creative and get outside of our building and meet people right in their living rooms, right in their cars, right in the cubicles on their jobs. Now we can reach people and exercise a creative faith that says we do not have to define church the way we've always defined church. We do not have to limit fellowship and limit worship because of geographical boundaries. Now we can be connected and hope that as a result of that connectivity, we lead more souls to heaven than ever before. Think about the fact that healthcare facilities are moving to telemedicine options. Schools from elementary to university levels are offering distance learning and virtual options. Restaurants and retailers have created contactless pickup and delivery choices. Companies are finding more productivity in workers working from home. The judicial system, including the Supreme Court, they're finding new ways to hold court. The church must evolve in order to be relevant. Where do we go from here? We have been asked this question by many who are listening on this call this morning. Many who are listening to our calls during the night are saying, what will happen to this after this crisis? Will this endeavor stop? Will you stop offering prayer? Will you stop offering commentary? Will you stop giving a message? What will happen? And I'm going to tell you what's going to happen after this pandemic is we're going to keep on doing what we've been doing. We're going to keep on reaching out. We're going to keep on establishing ourselves in such a way that those in remote places, those in distant places, those who desire to benefit from this ministry can, that those who are sitting 1,000 miles away, if they so choose to be a member and a part of what we're doing, we're going to keep doing that because God is calling us to a faith that says you cannot keep doing what you've always done and expect some different results, that we're going to use that faith in a creative way so that we can keep on reaching people for God's glory and for God's honor. And then last, where do we go from here is not only a matter of our ability to become uncomfortable conquerors. It is not only a matter of our determination to be creative, but we have to be committed. As we think about Abraham, Abraham is not unlike any other great person in that we celebrate their achievements, their accomplishments, but we ignore all that came behind that. We look at the glory of the person, and we don't realize how much story is behind that glory. If you're taking notes, I want you to take note of some things that happened in Abraham's life. It's important that you understand that this man who is listed as a great man of faith had problems just like we face. Abraham was not exempt from the worst. He just had access to the best. We're not exempt from the worst. We just have access to the best. In Genesis chapter 12 and verse number 10, Abraham had to deal with a famine in the land. In Genesis chapter 12, verses 14 through 15, his wife was taken by Pharaoh. In Genesis chapter 13 and chapter 14, his nephew Lot had to deal with personal difficulties, and sometimes the choices our loved ones make, whether they know it or not, affects us. And their ill-timed and bad choices inflicts much pain and harm to us. And so it was when Lot pitched his tent toward Sodom. In Genesis chapter 15, Abraham and his wife had to face the reality of Sarah's barrenness, her inability to have a child through natural means. In Genesis chapter 16, Abraham and Sarah had to suffer the consequences of a bad choice, and that Hagar was given to Abraham, and this resulted in a child, Ishmael, being born. And this proved to be difficult for Sarah and caused much problems between Sarah and Hagar, and even the descendants of Ishmael and Isaac results in war and conflict in the world even to this present time. Genesis chapter 18, verses 12 and 13. Abraham had to deal with a wife whose faith was so shallow in the moment that she laughed at God at the thought that she would have a baby in her old age. Genesis chapter 19. Abraham again had problems in his family. When the Sodomites went to Lot's house, and the vicious men of that city tried to rape guests who were residing at the house. Genesis chapter 22, Abraham's faith was challenged when God told him to offer Isaac, his the son of promise, not his only son, Ishmael being one of his sons, but the son of promise, Isaac, as a sacrifice. Certainly that was an uncomfortable moment. In Genesis chapter 23, Abraham's beloved wife, Sarah, died. And I've walked you through this brief narrative of Abraham's life to talk about the famine, to talk about his wife being taken by Pharaoh, the difficulties of Lot, the barrenness of his wife, the problems with Hagar and Ishmael, the lack of faith of Sarah, the problems with the Sodomites, the challenge to offer Isaac, the death of Sarah, to let you know that Abraham is a person of glory, but Abraham had as much story in his life as any one of us. But he had a faith that was committed. A faith that says, I'm not going to give up because of a famine. I'm not going to give up because of problems in my family. I'm not going to give up because I experience things that I don't desire. I'm not going to give up even in the most horrific realities of life. I will not give up. I will be committed. Beloved, what I'm trying to tell you today is that if you want to know where do we go from here, you've got to determine how committed you are to get to wherever we're trying to get to. It takes commitment that says I'm not going to fall apart when life presents me problems. I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to abandon ship. I'm going to trust God. I'm going to serve God. I'm going to do that which God has called me to do. They can keep arguing in Congress all they want. They can keep arguing with the president and the CDC. We can continue to have clashes with health over wealth or wealth over health. We can keep having problems with those who want to reopen the country and those who want to keep the country closed. We can still see bad news on television. We can still have problems in our families. Jobs can continue to downsize. We can name every problem that man can encounter, but the real thing here is to determine how committed are we. If Abraham had given up at any point in his life when he encountered any of those problems, Abraham would not be listed in Hebrews chapter 11 as a person who conquered by faith. Beloved, don't abandon your faith. Don't give up. Don't leave the ship of Zion. Trust in the Lord and be committed, and know that on the other side is victory. On the other side is our peace. On the other side is our ability to have contentment. But until we get to the other side, we might have to be uncomfortable, but always remember that conquerors are never comfortable all the time, and folks who are comfortable all the time are never conquerors. I think that's worth repeating. Conquerors are never comfortable all the time, and folks who are comfortable all the time are never conquerors. We have to be creative. We have to find new ways of doing God's mission for us, God's purpose for us. We have to do things in a new way, in a creative way. And we don't want anybody to think that when this problem is over, when this pandemic subsides, that when we get on the other side, that we're going to abandon you or that we're going to be disconnected. We're going to stay as connected as you want to be. We're going to be as committed as you want to be committed. We're going to be there. We're going to have church. We're going to have worship. We're going to have praise. We're going to have fellowship. We're going to be able to edify and help God's people, because we have to find creativity in the midst of a crisis, and we have to be committed. And I promise you that if you're willing to be uncomfortable to be a conqueror, if you're willing to be creative in the midst of a crisis, and if you are committed, God will show you a blessing that you have never seen before, and we will come through this better than when we were in it. And I promise you that as a result, if God gets the glory, that he'll share that glory by giving us his favor. He will share that by allowing us to be recipients, not because he owes it to us, but because he chooses to give that to us. How do we know that? Because that same Bible that we read about Abraham's faith says that God is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him by faith. And so if we continue in a faith that finds us uncomfortable, a faith that finds us creative, and a faith that finds us committed, God will reward you. And what God rewards you, you don't have to worry about the IRS taxing it. What God rewards you, you can't be afraid of man trying to take it, because what God has for you, can't no man take it from you. When God opens a door for you, can't nobody close it. And even if they try to close the door, God will open up some windows for you. You just have to trust God to say, Lord, I'm uncomfortable, but that's all right, because conquerors are uncomfortable. Lord, I'm going to be creative in the midst of my crises. And Lord, I'm going to be committed, because when I read Abraham's life, I see a man that's got glory, but I see a man with some story. And since I'm in my story right now, I'm going to trust my glory is going to come in due time. The Bible says we shall reap if we faint not. Beloved, don't give up on God. Don't abandon God. Don't wave the white flag of surrender. Be committed, and you too can have some glory after your story. May God bless you as we try to be people of great faith. Where do we go from here? We can go wherever your faith says go. We are limited by faith. and we are empowered by faith. We can reach whatever limits your faith say. If you have little faith, we're going to go little places. If you have great faith, we can go to great places. If you have limited faith, we'll have limited power. But if you have great faith, we'll have great power. I hope, trust, and pray that something has been said to help you as we navigate through these difficult times. May God bless you and may God keep you as we call on Brother Gerald Brown to offer us a song of encouragement.